across their different time zones to be here. A special thanks, of course, to Jansu Boston and the faculty and students in the Sociology of Law Department at Lund University for organizing this event, and for Ida for her wonderful welcome and introduction to this public lecture series. I'm extremely honored and thrilled to have been invited to give the first public lecture in honor of Reza. But before I go on, I just want to do a land acknowledgement. As I say, I'm sitting in my office in Southern California, and would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Achaman and Tongva peoples, and that we are deeply respectful of their care for and teachings about our interconnected relations with the earth. And many, of course, of the indigenous perspectives of the local Southern California tribes are part of the sort of background conversation to my talk today. We all, thank you very much again, Ida, for your opening remarks about Reza. We all have extreme fondness for his extraordinary work and his collegiality over many, many years. And as I say, this is a great honor to be here today to remind us all of the kind of extraordinary thinking and intellectual work of one of our leading colleagues in the field of sociolegal studies. For my talk today, I'm going to be building a little bit on Professor Banakar's concern with the concept of legal pluralism, which was one of his sort of primary concerns, particularly in the context of globalization and the European Union. And he was always adamant that social legal scholars think beyond a monolithic Western legal system and engage with cultural diversity and related pluralist understandings of law. And I want to take that concept of legal pluralism, which has also been very important in my own work, and start, the anchoring, of this conversation in the recent COP26 negotiations on climate change, because as this picture from the demonstrations on the street indicate, pluralism, cultural pluralism, legal pluralism, all sorts of pluralist and diverse attitudes are very evident in the concern, the global concern about climate crises and emerging climate injustices. So with taking COP26 as my starting point, I want to talk today a little bit about law's relationship with and functioning within non-human worlds that are comprised, of course, of trees, rivers, birds, fish, as well as ecological systems that we typically can't see, including bacteria, zoonotic diseases, the ozone layer, viruses, and so on. This natural world that some people call more than human worlds, and I'll talk a little bit further later on about what we mean by more than human worlds, is the wider context in which all life subsists and the very concept of humanity is defined. And it necessarily frames the context in which diverse laws and legal processes are informed, take shape, unfold, and have meaning for many, many people around the world in different ways and diverse sort of systems of meaning. But what drives this talk today is my alarm, along with many other people's alarm, that the natural world rarely comes into play when we analyze and define law and the social relations that law engenders. And as this image of members of the Sapara Nation from the Amazonian region are on a panel at the COP26 recent negotiations, their distress should be our distress, right? There were many, many concerns amongst marginalized groups and indigenous communities in particular who really did not have the same presence and place at the table of negotiations at COP26, indicating once again, affirming once again, their marginalization in global governance conversations. So I'm urging us to be as alarmed as other peoples around the world are about the emerging climate crises, even if we in Southern California or in Europe are not so immediately impacted by these crises as others who are disproportionately impacted, of course, typically in the global South. One of the core challenges, I think, for social legal research today is that we typically only think about people-to-people relationships because it is the individual person who is commonly understood as the subject of law. Importantly, this legal subject is seen as operating autonomously outside of nature. As William Cronin noted in his important book On Common Ground, Western intellectual thought constructed a particular image of what constitutes nature. And in his words, he wrote, "The place where we are is the place where nature is not." What Cronin underscores in his work is that for most of us in the Euro-American Academy, we typically don't think about our relationships with or through the natural world. And it's as if we have some kind of blind spot, some intellectual blinkered incapacity to think about human and non-human relations in a very integrated fashion. We're unable very often to acknowledge that we are all place-based beings and that law is experienced through everyday interactions that include that of the environment. And again, these are animals and bacteria and all sorts of ecological forests and trees and ecological systems. So my argument is we seem unable to think with or through our relations to insects and whales, rivers and trees, or the consequences of climate emergency with rising oceans, and of course, catastrophic fires. For some of you who know I'm Australian, this of course is very pertinent to my way of thinking. This long-standing blinkered thinking within, this long-standing blinkered thinking in sociolegal scholarship about the significance of the natural world has framed the way we think about law for decades, and today remains the dominant way or paradigm of thinking about law and social, political, and economic relationships. Nature is basically taken out, silenced, devoid of how we think about law's processes. So today, just a little bit of an overview. I want to talk about what we mean by more than human worlds. First off, I want to talk a little bit about the implications of the culture-nature binary that sort of is still such a dominant way of us thinking in terms of our relationships to the natural world. I want to reflect a little bit about the implications of ignoring climate change and ecological crisis in social legal scholarship. And then I want to summarize very briefly, I am aware of the time, about what's at stake and why should we care about more than human worlds. So I do want to say, and this is important, from the very outset here, I want to say that I am not, of course, alone in urging us to reframe social legal scholarship by engaging with more than human worlds. In recent years, new scholarship has emerged exploring the co-constitutive relations of law with water and oceans, sharks, pigs, seals, and forests. And here I'm thinking of the work of John Bobo Killer and Noinoy Silva, who examine human and non-human relations with indigenous imaginaries that resist and challenge neocolonial legality in Hawaii. So they've written a very important article about the indigenous resistance to this nature-culture binary and how it plays out in Hawaii today. I'm also wanting to point out that the work of Iris Braverman has been extraordinary in her writings on animals and coral reefs. And for a while now, she's been calling for us all to think about more than human legalities. Related to her work is an exciting body of socio-legal scholarship that calls us to think through oceans. Ronissa Malwani here and her Oceans of Law book is very important, as is Iris Braverman's and Elizabeth Johnson's new edited volume called Blue Legalities, which is a very exciting set of essays exploring how land-based law, governance, and regulatory frameworks are reworked and reconstituted through life below the water's surface in what they call more than human oceans, a very recent, exciting volume, as I say. This talk is also indebted to the work of many legal geographers who have shown us that space is not just the background to law, but rather the materiality of place actively informs how law operates and is produced. And then, beyond obvious legal scholarship, this talk is indebted to many theorists dealing with environmental humanities scholarship, ecofeminism, new materialism, decolonial, and post-human perspectives. But as I started off with my land acknowledgement, perhaps most importantly of all, this talk is very much indebted to the work of Indigenous scholars around the world who are helping us understand the limits of our dominant socio-legal conversations. So I just want to reiterate, I'm not sort of offering anything new in this talk. I'm just trying to sort of repackage it in a way, bringing in these lines of inquiry and theoretical perspectives together and call for us all to broaden our legal imaginaries to include more than human worlds within mainstream socio-legal inquiry, right? So again, it's not that there hasn't been some socio-legal scholarship that is very innovative and creative and building out these conversations. This is more just an attempt to try and bring it together and urge us to refocus and reframe how we think about socio-legal scholarship more generally in the mainstream world of law and society. So let us talk a little bit about more than human worlds. Some people use this term, others say nature-culture nexus, others call the term other than human worlds. So there's a variety of ways that this terminology is discussed, but at its core, the concept of more than human worlds is actually quite simple. The expression refers to a world that includes and exceeds humans, underscoring the complex interdependencies between all biological life on the planet. It fundamentally seeks to disrupt the dominant nature versus culture binary and refutes the worldview that sees humans as superior in their belief that they can control nature. So the more than human world as an expression means thinking of ourselves as living within and being part of nature, what Donna Haraway calls nature cultures, right? So the term more than human world is often associated with the philosopher David Abram, but his ideas are deeply informed by First Nations and Indigenous communities who see kinship and intimate relations with all biological things. In the more than human framework, people are not understood as autonomous entities distinct from the natural world. Rather, according to the anthropologist Tim Ingold, humans are understood as fluid beings with flexible, porous boundaries. They are necessarily embedded in relations neither purely biological nor purely social. And this goes on, Tim Ingold says that, it goes on to say that humans are not fixed content independent entities, right? So that's, I think, a very important core of this idea, that humans are not fixed, autonomous, independent, and static in a certain way. So when we think about the more than human framework more generally, it underscores the relational ways that we should be thinking about human and non-human social interactions. And for instance, this is a quote that I think is very beautiful. It's written by Jack Forbes, who was an Indigenous scholar and activist and a founder of the first Native American Studies program at University of California, Davis. And I think this quote sums up what I'm trying to get to and others are trying to get to. This is what he wrote. I can lose my hands and still live. I can lose my legs and still live. I can lose my eyes and still live. But if I lose the air, I die. If I lose the sun, I die. If I lose the earth, I die. If I lose the water, I die. If I lose the plants and animals, I die. All of these things are more part of me, more essential to my every breath than my so-called body. And that's, I think, a very beautiful poetic quote that sort of sums up this notion of where our body and the boundaries of our body end or blur with the natural environment. So in the context of climate change, I think this relational worldview has been taken up by many environmental justice movements, climate justice movements, and many activists and organizers increasingly are seeing that we need to rethink our relationship with nature if we are going to mitigate climate catastrophe and massive biodiversity loss. So I think that beyond scholarship in general, amongst particularly younger people, younger generations, there is a much more open willingness to understand their being in the world as part of a relationship with the environment and with natural processes. And so I think there's a great deal of hope in youth for teaching us scholars in the ivory tower how to rethink and conceptualize these very complex relationships. And of course, the more than human world as a framework has informed a great deal of scholarship beyond the legal arena, across the humanities, the health sciences, and so on. So this is the question that I ask in this talk. Why the more than human world, which is being taken up as a sort of central analytical framework in other scholarship and in activist movements and so on. Why is it very, very absent, very extraordinarily absent in mainstream social legal scholarship? And I want to argue that in the Euro-American Academy, this relational understanding of human and non-human relationships really just does not align with how we think about our place in the world. Western law demands that humans be abstracted, essentialized, and removed from contexts, practices, and assemblages of being in place. And I think this diagram is my very immature or a naive attempt to try and visualize how we in the Western world and in predominantly Western legal systems think about the relationships between laws and economies, between our relationship between law and societies, and then the third, a relationship with ecological systems and nature. And this is how we typically in our social legal framework think of these arenas, that they're rather discrete, that they may overlap at times, but ultimately that non-human biological life and its links to lands are largely encased within property law and bound to ideas of individual and corporate ownership and possession. In this dominant paradigm, law, in other words, is understood as managing the environment and the social and political relations it shares with people, right? Law is separate and it is managing societies and managing natural systems. In contrast, a more than human world would look sort of something like this. And this is meant to be a visualization of these relationships as synergistic, mutually constitutive, but ultimately societies and ultimately law within societies is framed by what is often called the web of life. In other words, humans might come and go as a species, but ecological systems, they'll shift, they'll adapt, and they will continue on without us. That the ecological worlds that we inhabit are actually the bigger encompassing framework that we should be situating human and societies and legal systems within, rather than in some way thinking that law and societies can manage the natural world. And I think these two slides for me help indicate the different understandings of human relationships with nature and law's role in negotiating these complex relationships. And these two different images is where I want to sort of highlight, I think, as our intellectual blind spot in social legal research. So I'm now going to turn to a very brief conversation about culture and nature. Much has been written about the rigid dualism that divides culture from nature and humans from non-humans, this binary substantiated capitalist and colonial relations between Europeans and the worlds they conquered. And this is just an image that I think is fantastic from Kew Gardens in London. It's from the Economic Botany Museum. Again, you can see here that even the name of the museum indicates that botany and plants were collected, of course, in the 19th century for their financial profit-making capacities. Conveniently, certain people were also deemed non-human and so also objects of Euro-American law and domination and exploitation. And of course, the humans that I'm thinking here most obviously are indigenous peoples, as well as Africans caught up in the transatlantic slave trade. What I'm trying to get here is that modern Western law enabled the European domination of lands and peoples, and also enabled a logic of extractive capitalism across waves of colonialism. In the post-Second World War era, so in the later part of the last century, international economic law further cemented legal relations between so-called developing and developed worlds, ensuring a legal system biased towards European and North American countries. And it is very much to this day a sort of wide dominant paradigm that countries in the global south, societies in the global south, provide the natural resources for the global north in the form of gold and minerals and so on, as well as the human resources in the form of cheap labor and disposable labor. So this logic of extractive capitalism, upon which culture, of course, is the dominant player, and its exploitation of nature still is very much part of our current framing of social legal scholarship today. Now, this is, I'll go quickly through this because I can see that time is short, but this is a set of binaries that basically are very much part of the West intellectual consciousness. In her important book, Feminism and the Mastery of Nature, ecofeminist Val Plumwood called these dualisms the foundational delusion of the West, right? And this is sort of the culture-nature divide parallels with other binaries that very much inform our Western worldview. Now, fortunately, law and society has come in. Of course, social legal scholarship for the last 50 or 60 or so years has been very, very, very important in breaking up these binaries, many of these binaries, right? Law and society scholarship has taken to task the divide between genders, between sexualities, between the notion of master and slave. More generally. So what I'm wanting to sort of point out is that we need to confront in social legal scholarship general unwillingness to engage with law's relations with more than human worlds. And this matters, I think, on two very important fronts. The first is that we sort of still continue to fail to see the enduring legacies of environmental degradation and oppression of formerly colonized peoples. And in the context of climate crisis and its disproportionate impact on poor and people of color, particularly in the global south, we also have a blind spot in engaging with environmental degradations and climate injustices in our contemporary world. So I'm going to talk quickly here about the historical context that we as social legal scholars, consciously or otherwise, have overlooked for over 30 years. And I want to begin here a little bit of a historical look backwards to 1988. And this is the year that the climatologist James Hansen spoke publicly in the US Congress about greenhouse gas emissions and the building atmosphere's warming of the atmosphere, right? So this is 1988. And this is at the moment where, in fact, climate science goes public, as it were. And it's impossible from this moment on to deny the looming planetary crisis of environmental climate change. In the same year, 1988, the Global Climate Coalition was formed by the producers and users of fossil fuels. So in reaction to this public declaration that climate change is happening, that greenhouse gas emissions are on the rise, that we're going to face a looming crisis, you have the producers and users of fossil fuels organizing a very powerful think tank and global advocacy lobby group. And this is called the Global Climate Coalition. And there's a little picture here in the bottom left-hand of the PowerPoint slides. So this was formed in reaction to the public acknowledgement of climate change. And as I say, became an extraordinarily powerful industry group active in climate policy, negotiating climate policy, and in a sense, affirming the denial of climate change science, right? So millions and millions was put into quasi-scientific reports denouncing climate science proof. ExxonMobil, the Koch Industries, all these kinds of huge multinational fossil fuel companies were intent on spending millions of dollars on lobbyists and think tanks and quasi-scientific research promoting climate science denial and skepticism, right? It's a direct reaction to James Hansen's public declaration that we're on a trajectory of a warming planet. So what this tells us is that widespread scientific evidence is very public for decades, right? And we have the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. We have the UN COP reports annually for 26 years. Yet despite these increasing calls for us to pay attention to environmental degradation and its disproportionate impacts on poor and marginalized people, social legal scholars have remained notably disinterested in this topic, right? There was, of course, in the 1980s and 90s by some important sociologists who worked on inner city environmental degradation, talked a lot about environmental racism. I'm thinking of people like Robert Bullard in the United States. So it's not that social legal scholars haven't been thinking about environmental racism, but it has been very much a small group of sociologists and very much a conversation that when 9/11 happened, a lot of the discussions about environmental racism in inner city context in particular was eclipsed by other dominant geopolitical concerns. Against that, recently, a few social legal scholars have been publishing very, very exciting work on how international law has enabled capitalism, resulting in loss of biodiversity and fragile ecosystems. And there are two books I just want to highlight that I think have been extremely interesting and very, very important. One is by Julia Dem, called Reconsidering Red, about deforestation. And the other is Used and Justified and provides the logistical authority for the sort of global evisceration of forests and fish life in the ocean. So these are just two, as I say, very exciting new books coming out last year and this year. Unveiling the neoliberal logics that have been enabled by domestic and international law in biodiversity loss. But what I want to highlight is that the bigger message that this work of these younger scholars and environmental law more generally is really discussed. And the bigger message points to an urgent need to rethink our exploitative relations with the natural world in the first place. So, putting this somewhat differently, this scholarship, this extraordinary scholarship in the field of environmental law, doesn't necessarily lead to disrupting our modernist assumption of the divide between culture and nature. It shows us the horrifying consequences of this divide, but it isn't generating a widespread intellectual shift that demands its dismantlement. And that's my concern. We understand where law is enabling this kind of environmental devastation. We can see it in this wonderful new scholarship, social legal scholarship, but it's not actually generating a grand rethinking as a field of inquiry, critical inquiry, about dismantling the nature-culture divide on which all this devastation pivots. So, my question, and I'd love to hear, not in the Zoom, of course, we haven't the time, but I'd love to hear why people think social legal scholars are so generally disinterested in law's role in global environmental degradation. I think it would, that's what I want to have, a conversation with people to reflect why is this gap in thinking so self-evident, and how we can move beyond and think about dismantling our Enlightenment binaries that are still so dominant. But in the brief time remaining, I want to summarize very quickly what I think is at stake in this disinterest in the law's relationship with the environment, and why social legal scholars should engage the complex relations between legal systems and the places in which people live. So first, I want to argue that if we are going to take the concept of legal pluralism seriously, as Reza Banakar would have us do, we must appreciate that for many millions of people around the world, their concept of law makes little distinction between humans and non-humans as legal subjects. And in fact, legal authority is often drawn from deep kinship relationships and connections with what we in broad brushstrokes call the environment. In short, we need to aggressively critique the modernist binary of culture versus nature if we are serious about fostering inclusive and equitable societies. That's my first point. The second point about why I think we need to rethink our social legal frameworks is that if we continue to ignore how law functions within more than human worlds, we participate in a coloniality of knowledge production by silencing and ignoring other ways of understanding what law is and means for other people different from ourselves. And more instrumentally, perhaps, if we want to think in instrumental terms, we also silence other ways of living within complex ecological systems that may be critical for our future survival as a species. And here I'm referring to increasing interest among climate justice movements for understanding how Indigenous and First Nations peoples relate to the land and learning from their very respectful relationship and kinship networks with the environment. The third reason why I think we should take stock and rethink contexts of law, and this third position is very much related to my first and second point. By marginalizing knowledge about how environments inform legal and social relations, we have stripped from the Western worldview an appreciation of the importance of nature. In turn, we have created a particular exclusive version of humanity disconnected from the environment, forged in the connected exploitation of the natural world and oppression of racialized peoples. This means, I think, that our scholarship arguably is complicit in reaffirming a hierarchy of human value where some people, like the giant bluefin tuna, are considered less important and even disposable. And I think this is a very serious charge about our social legal mainstream scholarship, that we are arguably complicit in reaffirming a hierarchy of people by denouncing and devaluing the environments in which we live. Fourthly, and finally, we need to think about law in more than human worlds because frankly, we don't have that much choice. Temperatures are rising and the sovereign territories on which the scaffolding of modern Western law are built, the territories on which the scaffolding of modern Western law are built are buckling, they're warping, and they're transforming beneath our feet. Human-driven climate change is already modifying how we move about in the world, and climate change is forcing all of us, even those of us living in the privileged global north, to rethink our legal, political, and social relations with the environments we inhabit. In Bruno Latour's words, the earth is turning back on itself, and the land that we so confidently occupied in the past is now actively occupying us. So this fourth point, final point in terms of why we should care and how we should adjust our thinking is very much about that there is very little choice. We are facing climate crises, emergencies, floods, warming planet, and so on. So we are actually being put in a position in which we can put our head in the sand, which we have up to this point, or we can actually start as a field of inquiry, critical inquiry, think about our future place in it and what our scholarship should be focusing on. So by way of conclusion, I'm watching the time. By way of conclusion, I want to make a confession. My arguing for reframing law in more than human worlds is driven by a selfish desire to disrupt the extractive logics of global capitalism and an urging for all of us to push back against the terrifying trajectory of a burning planet. I would imagine that every one of us, from whatever place we inhabit on the earth, would agree with the many thousands of demonstrators in the streets of Glasgow at the recent COP26 conference. Time is running out. And this picture, this is from the tar sands in Alberta, Canada, a vast, vast area of tar sand extractions from the earth that has just completely decimated old world forests as far as the eye can see, is a sort of good backdrop for the sense of urgency and crisis that we are faced. So against the specter of catastrophic fires and floods, I'm arguing that we need to put front and center the connected environmental and racial injustices of our present moment. Quite apart from being the ethical thing to do, this reframing to include more than human worlds in our socio-legal research and to challenge the dominant paradigm that we control nature is essential if we want our scholarship to remain relevant in a heating planet. And that's my take-home message. To be relevant social legal scholars, we actually need to take seriously the state of affairs and how our blinkered thinking has actually is precluding us from engaging with what's right before us and actually destabilizing the very territories on which our understandings of law have been built and have become the dominant way of managing, supposedly managing nature. So with that, that is my conclusion, and thank you very much for spending the time in the evening for those in Sweden and for other time zones, for others on this Zoom. And I welcome very much an open conversation moving forward, not just in the Q&A time now, but of course moving forward to how we can think about pushing a different kind of conversation in social legal scholarship more generally. Thank you very much again for having me at this public lecture.